Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I am John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. A good topic? Let's do it. People who witnessed a murder. What happened? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. I got 3 of them. The first one was in the early 90s. I was in a convenience store playing Fatal Fury or some shit, and then I heard a pop followed by squealing tires. I thought it was a car backfiring, but then I ran outside and saw a guy sitting on the sidewalk holding his stomach. Blood was starting to flow on the ground, and a crowd gathered, so I went back inside to watch from a more secure location. There was a homeless black guy in there with me who was refusing to leave the store because he thought the police would blame him. They're going to arrest the first N they see. First N they see. Found out on the news later that the guy died. Second was ear witness only, and in the early 2000s. I was doing whatever on the computer when I heard a series of pops. My neighborhood wasn't a great one, so I was used to overnight gunfire and didn't want to get involved. In the morning, the house next door is crawling with police. Turns out 3 college kids were murdered execution style overnight. I left town shortly afterwards. The last one was also ear witness, and only a few months ago. I live next to a biker bar, and while it's been pretty quiet because of COVID, there was an incident over the summer where I was just falling asleep when I heard loud bikes going up and down the street. Then there was that pop. I knew instantly what it was, reported it with the police, then went to sleep. Next morning, the police have my street cordoned off, and there's a crashed bike in the middle of the street. They had already cleaned up the body, but there was still a bunch of blood everywhere. Apparently there was a bar fight the night before, and someone chased another biker down and gunned him down in front of my apartment complex. Recently, back in 2019, motorcycle. I was riding with a group of 4. We were on an expressway, limited access, that was 2 lanes. Moderately full expressway, I think 50 to 55 miles per hour because of traffic. The speed limit was 60. I'll always remember it. A 2018 lifted red F-150 decided to merge from the left lane to the right lane. He definitely looked behind him and saw me, placement number 4, and another motorcycle in front of me, placement number 3. He didn't look directly to his right, placement number 2. He went full force merge right, successfully cutting us off. He also hit the motorcycle to the right of him, pitting him to the ground and killing him. The truck then slammed on his brakes after hitting the motorcycle. The person in front of me slammed into the back of his pickup and flew into the bed of his truck. I had thankfully dodged the F-150 and went in front of him. 3 seconds later, the F-150 was tapped by another F-150, black truck, I forget the year, and it hurts so much to even describe this. I just can't watch the GoPro. The lifted F-150 driver was pissed that this brand new truck was damaged. He was getting into a fight with the other F-150 driver and the motorcyclist in his bed about the damages and was explaining that he would owe 2 trucks instead. He was apparently related to some lawyer and would sue for millions. I completely forgot he just hit 2 motorcycles. We searched for what felt like forever, finding our friend. It was probably only 2 minutes. We got to him and he looked normal, no blood, and the helmet was still intact. We didn't touch him and were calling 911. He never responded to any questions. We shined a light in his eyes and they didn't respond. We ignored MSF and started removing his jacket to feel for a pulse and saw an unbelievable amount of blood. I wasn't prepared. I know at that moment he was dead, but I tried my hardest to apply pressure. It wasn't helping. I started screaming at the lifted F-150 driver. I started screaming at my friend, placement number 1, for deciding to go on a drive. I started screaming at my dead friend for dying. I started cursing God for killing him. I blamed myself for convincing him to join us. I just wanted to die. I had given up applying pressure to my friend, knowing he was dead, and decided to run in front of the expressway, trying to get hit and die too. My friends held me down and forced me to the ground. I don't have health insurance, so I cannot see counseling or therapy. I blame myself. I honestly don't really want to live, but I just try to make ends meet. The lifted F-150 driver got his ticket dismissed because I was screaming, "I killed him," during the crisis while my friends were tackling me. The driver never faced any consequences. He wasn't drunk or distracted. He was just stupid and didn't look. But the system protected him instead of me. I was forced something from the paramedics and was taken to the hospital by ambulance. I had and have no insurance because I make too much for Medicare and food stamps, but I skipped meals to pay rent. I have debt collectors for my medical debt because my friend died. I still have nightmares of the night. I witnessed a murder. My friend was hit by an inattentive driver. I lost a friend and all my others too because I can't talk to them anymore. I lost my job because I wouldn't ride my motorcycle to work and I can't afford a car. I have thousands in medical bills from overnight suicide watch. I wake up every night in panic. I can't get help because apparently medical care isn't a human right. I stopped going to classes because all I could do was think of the blood. I'm living in my girlfriend's apartment now. I told you more to you than I have to her, and I started sleeping on the sofa because I don't want to become too close. I don't know. The situation is effed. It wasn't until March that I started to receive food assistance. I'm still fighting for Medicare access. Insurance won't cover anything because I wasn't hit. I promised my girlfriend that as soon as I start seeing a therapist, I'll return to normal. I hope I can keep my promise. I'm still scared. I hope 2021 is better, but I doubt it will be. I posted on a throwaway for obvious reasons. So at the time, I lived on the top floor of a 12-story apartment building. We got home around 11 p.m. from a movie. 30 or so minutes later, we heard a domestic starting in the unit right across from our door. You were looking at their front door when looking out our peephole. After a couple of minutes, it made its way into the hall, and I got up to be nosy and look out the peephole. Turns out the girl who lived in the unit, her ex, father of her son, showed up because she was having problems with her current boyfriend who lived with her. The two men got physical, and the boyfriend stabbed the father 3 times in the chest with a steak knife. I watched from the peephole in our door and was completely frozen with fear, and all I could do was tell my boyfriend to call the cops. BF took off down the stairwell. I opened the door and the father fell into our apartment and basically into the arms and lap. Paramedics arrived fast and rushed him to the hospital. Police apprehended the father on the same block. I gave a statement in the same clothes I was wearing, which had blood all over them. Still went to work the next morning. I tried to call in, but my supervisor had no compassion, and I was only 20 and didn't know how to stand up for myself. The father survived, and we later were able to see him, and he thanked us basically for saving his life. He also went through the whole court system as key witness for about a year. As far as I know, the boyfriend is still in prison. This was 11 years ago. I don't think of this event often, but when I do, I still feel shitty inside for not opening the door sooner to try to stop it. I was 6 to 7 years old playing with my sister in our backyard. We heard something and thought it was just a firecracker since firecrackers are normal in our country. Then we heard screaming, and out of nowhere a man was running in our backyard. He stopped for a moment, looked at us, then jumped off the fence. We went to the front yard to see what was going on and saw our neighbor being carried to a car to be taken to the hospital. We couldn't understand what was happening until my mother ushered us inside and said our neighbor was shot. After a few days, some witnesses say the guy who shot him ran into our yard, and that's the only time we realized the guy we saw was the murderer. Police never asked us about anything. To be honest, I couldn't remember his face. It happened so fast. All I could remember was the screams I heard. When I was in high school and first years of college, my country started a horrible wave of violence related to narco traffic and organized crime. My city was particularly affected by this, so I happened to witness 2 murders related to this, both on my way to college. First, I was on a bus heading to the subway, and I saw a lot of soldiers out of a convenience store. It was super common to see soldiers on the street back then, so it didn't bother me. However, there was a military truck in the parking lot, and I saw, underneath the truck, the legs of a man lying on the floor. In my 17-year-old mind, I thought he was just a homeless person asleep in the parking lot of the store. But a soldier approached him, pointed his gun at this man, and shot him. Thankfully, I didn't see the whole scene, but I saw when the soldier shot, and how the legs of the man moved a bit when the blood rush was growing on the soil, and then he didn't move anymore. Hours later, I saw in the news he was an extortionist. The second one was way worse. I was again heading to the college, and I had to pass under a big vehicular bridge. Nothing remarkable. But that day a man was hanging from the neck with a chain on the highest point of that bridge. Next to him was a huge blanket with a menacing text from some narco trafficker against whoever enemy he had. I don't know if this man was already dead, and it was the wind that was moving him, but it was so shocking. I had to take therapy for a long time to get over it. Around 5 to 6 years ago, I was returning from a church at 7 to 8 at night. The country I live in gets dark fast, when I heard a pair of screams coming from one of the nearby streets that is usually pacific, even at night. Now, and taking into consideration that by the time the story happened, I was a pushy teenager who was relatively good at martial arts, I ran up to the street where screams came off to see what was happening, only for seeing a middle-aged man on top of a motorcycle with a gun in his hands, shooting an elderly woman twice. While the man picked up what I assumed was her purse from the ground, I fled from the scene as soon as possible, returning to the street that leads to the way back to my home. When I finally arrived to my home, I didn't tell anything about this to my mother, and obviously didn't call the police either. I realized that what I did was very stupid, and I preferred to keep the secret as some macabre lesson from life. Though this is not the only murder I saw in my life, it was the first one and most shocking for me due to my age at the moment and the context of the situation. When I was a teen, I spent a couple of summers in this monastery in France, which was a place for different people to gather, do workshops, and socialize. It was a beautiful place in the mountains, very welcoming and peaceful. The central church was carpeted and separated into small rooms for workshops in the daytime, but the inner walls would be removed for the evening mass and could accommodate a few thousand people. We would mostly sing songs, and the monk who started this place would say a few words. One night, while he was speaking and preparing for some songs, a woman jumped at him with a knife and started stabbing him. She got removed pretty quickly, but the monk died almost instantly due to loss of blood and severity of his wounds. That night, the atmosphere was nothing like I ever experienced before or after, for that matter. Thousands of people were mourning, singing, and crying, gathered in the church. It was a surreal feeling. You could just feel that you couldn't control your empathy. I mean, all of these are tragic and sad, so I'm not going to really focus on any one in particular, but, I just hope people who witness things like this find a way to have an outlet to speak about it. So message boards like this, anonymous and simple as it may seem, could actually be a level of catharsis or help for people, so it's not easy. I was a freshman at my current high school, and am a senior now. It was Valentine's Day, but the whole day something felt kind of odd. The fire alarm went off during my second period English class, but it was just a drill. Later in the day, roughly 45-ish minutes left before I could go home, the fire alarm went off again. We were all confused, but followed procedure. I was on the third floor, so we had to go down a bunch of stairs, but on the way down, everyone turned around and was running back. That's when I heard the gunshots. I turned around and headed back to my classroom, running. The teacher was trying to unlock the door. They locked themselves when they closed, and I looked behind me and saw the shooter firing in my direction. I looked back and my teacher got the door open, so I ran inside and hid. The shooter was still firing shots, and I could hear screaming outside the door. Everything smelled like gunpowder and iron from the amount of blood. We were waiting for police for what felt like hours, but it was probably only 30 minutes until we were rescued. The whole time, waiting, I could hear someone outside screaming for help, but there was nothing we could do. We just waited. Once they rescued us, they had us line up with our hands on our heads and took us out of the building. There was blood all over the floors and walls, bodies on the staircase and in the hallways. 17 people died that day. I'll never forget any of it. 1. The first murder I witnessed was as a child. I was walking home from the drug abuse program that I hung out at. On a side note, I didn't use drugs, but they had a Super Nintendo and let us hang out. Walking home, I saw a guy shoot another guy with a hunting rifle. I ran straight home. The police were there in minutes. My grandmother told me they caught the guy. I really don't know. 2. The second murder I watched was a few years later. I was about 13 or 14. I was in the front yard with my cousin when the neighborhood crack dealer got into an argument directly in front of the house. The guy he was arguing with started riding off on his bike, and he pulled a sawed-off shotgun and shot him in the back of the head. Skin and chunks of stuff were still on the pavement for a few weeks. It smelled pretty bad. 3. The third was when I was 18. My roommate shot a guy in the throat with a sawed-off shotgun, once again with the sawed-off, at point-blank range. That shit was brutal. I was way too close for that. He recently got out of prison and contacted me via Facebook. I was astounded he thought I wanted to talk to him. 4. The next instance could be counted as the 4th, but it could also be counted as the 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th. I was in Iraq. It was my very first mission outside of the wire. It was technically training from the outgoing unit. We were heading to the Mark 19 range. The MK-19 is a 40mm automatic grenade launcher. We were told about a family that came to pick up brass from spent ammo. Apparently they didn't give the bedding to the other unit, or they just didn't care. As the family approached the unit that was training us, we unleashed hell on the Chevy Caprice. I was a brand new private and unsure what to do. I tried running it up the chain of command. I asked about it a few weeks later and was essentially told to mind my business. It was more professional sounding. Something to the tune of, we can't discuss an ongoing investigation, but the thing is, I was a willing eyewitness, and not once was I questioned. I know this won't get read by many, but for those that took the time to read it, thank you. This stuff eats at my soul, and I don't have many places I can talk about it. I think about these people often, and now someone else is too. That gives me some comfort. The night before we were supposed to move, me and my family were all sitting in our living room. Our lights were out, so there was no power and no AC. We were sitting by the window, and it was wide open, no curtains or screen, but luckily we didn't have lights, so you couldn't see 4 people sitting right there. Anyway, this car drove up and parked right in the middle of the street, and the next thing you see or hear is shots being fired. It lasted for at least several minutes. Me and my brother were the only 2 who didn't fall to the floor, and we saw the guys in the car unloading off rounds into the house. The car left. For about 5 minutes, everything was silent. Then you heard sirens. The ambulance got there, and after so long, they brought out my neighbor, the mom of 2 of my friends on the stretcher. We could hear her talking, so we assumed she was okay. Then a couple of hours later, her oldest daughter was on the phone screaming and crying with the hospital because they had told her that she apparently didn't make it. We were out of that neighborhood within the week. I always felt bad about it because I think about the days before, how nice she was and how I was friends with her kids. She didn't deserve to die that night. Well, I was walking down the 16th Street Mall in Denver, and I saw a homeless-looking person pushing another homeless-looking person in a wheelchair down the street. They bumped into another guy, an older dude, maybe 60 or something, and he said, "Hey, watch where you're going." The guy who was pushing the wheelchair said, "You watch where you're going." Other dude said, "F you." The younger dude punched him in the face. He was knocked out instantly and just fell like a tree that's been cut down by a lumberjack. His head hit the pavement before the rest of his body and just caved in like an overripe watermelon. Then blood spurted out of his other ear a few times, like 7 to 10 feet, and just stopped. The younger dude runs off pushing his friend. The cop comes by a few moments later, and I'm just standing there in shock. I described the guy and pointed him in the right direction. The cop came back a few minutes later and had me ID the guy, then drove off. 10 minutes have probably passed, and the dude's body is still lying there. An ambulance finally comes, loads him up, and drives off without sirens or lights. That's when I knew he was for sure dead. I went and sat on a bench, still in shock. Then a shopkeeper comes out with a hose and just sprays the blood on the sidewalk like it's something he does every day. A few minutes later, a family just walks by on a still damp pavement, none the wiser about what had just happened. It was absolutely surreal. I've seen one murder in my life, and this might be a bit of a ramble as the subject is one I always struggle to write about clearly. I was a somewhat normal 17-year-old senior in high school. I'd been partying a lot and had made some older friends that year. One of these friends was Avi. He was the nicest out of all of them, a super friendly guy who was super outgoing and always wanted to bring people together. Anyways, one day I went to a party with some friends at this girl's house just outside of town, slightly in the woods. Well, it was the usual experience for a senior in high school at a party with an older crowd. Kind of awkward, but enough familiar faces to be fun and worthwhile. At one point I met this guy who had small cuts on his face and cheek. They look self-inflicted. No accident would look like that. Nobody was comfortable around him, but nobody wanted to kick him out either. Another alarming feature about the guy was the knife at his wrist and waist. He had a Bowie knife just on his belt. It turns out this guy was an old friend of my friend Avi. They used to play video games together in middle school, and Avi had run into him in the park that day and invited him to the party. Anyhow, despite this strange guy, the night was going pretty well. Anyway, I'll get to the point. At midnight, Avi went outside to get something from his car. I think it was weed or his bong or something. At this point, I'm standing on the front porch, and the gravel driveway below is dimly lit. I'm talking to a girl that I had been seeing at the time. Out of nowhere comes an awful scream. I ran down toward the scream. When I got to the driveway, I saw my friend Avi on the ground. Standing above him was the guy he invited, holding his knife. He just stabbed Avi 5 times. I just ran over to Avi and started looking for his wounds. I don't know why, but my only focus was on finding the wound so I could stop the bleeding. I really don't understand what I was thinking because the guy with the knife was still just standing there. I found several stab holes and tried to hold pressure on them the best I could. One in the armpit, one in the back of the neck, and another on his abdomen. He died. I was holding this guy and he just died in my arms. And he didn't go peacefully. I won't forget the sound of him spitting up blood and making weird grunting sounds. I'll never forget the amount of blood covering his body and clothes, and I'm sure his F won't forget the smell. I hate talking about it because it's such a disgusting and brutal way to die, and I hate to think about him like that. You're probably a bit curious about the guy with the knife. It turns out he had some sort of schizophrenic episode, and he thought Avi was a demon or something. I don't know where he is now. Anyway, this will probably get buried, but I think it's helpful to write about.